Hello and welcome to our food safety training. Whether you're front of house or back of house, food safety is very important and we'll discuss that in just a moment. So, food safety training has several components. First, we're going to talk about why we should have food safety training, then foodborne illness prevention, hygiene and hand washing, the flow of food, food allergens, food safety management systems, safe facilities and equipment, cleaning and sanitizing, pest management, and inspections. First of all, why is food safety training important? Well, every year in the US, foodborne diseases cause 48 million illnesses, 128,000 hospitalizations, and 3,000 deaths. That's pretty scary, and we want to prevent that. And we can do that together. So there's three major hazards that we'll talk about. One is biological, the other is chemical, and biological, physical, and lastly, chemical. Biological hazards. There are pathogens and microbes that come from infected workers, unsanitary work surfaces, and contaminated water. Basically, these are living organisms, including bacteria, viruses, parasites, protozoa, and fungi. They're the number one cause of foodborne illness. Many of the risks associated with these contaminants can be controlled or removed with effective food handling practices. So it's critical that the safe practices are followed. Physical hazards are often things that you can see, such as hair, bandages, glass, or metal shavings. They can also be very small, but basically it's a piece of something normally that's been broken off or some kind of outside physical thing. The next thing is chemical hazards, which are toxins from cleaning agents and pesticides. And in addition to these hazards, or actually many of these hazards can be created if personal hygiene is lacking. So proper personal hygiene is critical. This includes showering and bathing regularly, keeping hair clean and covered or tied back, keeping clean clothing and footwear that's used only at work, regularly washing your hands, and using clean utensils for tasting food. For example, separate spoons every time you taste something, and also separate cloths for cleaning and wiping plates. Also, we have to wash our hands frequently. We need to wash them after sneezing, coughing, or touching your nose or mouth. Also, after smoking, after using the restroom, after handling raw foods, also after you're cleaning and wiping tables or food prep surfaces, if you're handling garbage, money, or other soiled items. And then also we need to know the proper hand washing techniques, which are, first of all, discarding any disposable gloves. This needs to happen after each task. You never wash gloves and reuse them. And then also, you're going to wet your hands with water, apply liquid soap for at least 20 to 30 seconds. You'll scrub the backs of your hands, wrists, all your fingers under your nails. Rinse under running water, pointing down toward the drain. Dry with a paper towel, and then if you turn off any taps using the paper towel, and if you have any doors to open, use that same paper towel to open those doors. Also, we need to know about the flow of food, which includes receiving, storing, preparing, and serving. When you're receiving food, you want to look at the delivery truck, but before you do that even, you should have carts, dollies, or any containers ready to receive that delivery. Also make sure there's enough space in the dry storage or walk-in areas for those deliveries. You'll inspect the deliveries immediately, making sure that, making sure that there's no contamination. Like even the vehicle itself, that there's no signs of pests, that it's clean. And if any of those issues occur, you need to reject that delivery. Also, you're going to inspect the food items themselves, count the quantities, spot check the weights, check for any damage, repackaging, mishandling. You'll also take the temperatures of all TCS food. This is really important that it comes in at the correct temperatures. When you're storing the cold food, it needs to be stored at 41 degrees or lower. Also, it needs to be labeled. It could be in its original packaging, or it can be repackaged and labeled with the date that the package was opened and the name of the product. Also, when you have things that are not at the correct temperature, if you are checking temperatures, or when you're checking temperatures rather, you need to throw out any food that is not at the correct temperature. So for example, if you go into the cooler and you check the temperature of meat, if that raw meat or even cooked meat has been in the refrigerator and or the refrigerator goes out and everything is at the lower temperature, then safety standards, then it has to be thrown away. The food label should include the common name of the food or a statement that correctly and accurately identifies it. If it's clear what the food is, for example, with apples or avocados, you do not need to label those. If you're holding any TCS food for more than 24 hours, it does have to be labeled with a date so that that can be either sold, eaten, or thrown out within 7 days. Also, when you're storing items in the cooler, meat, poultry, and seafood have to be in the coldest part away from the door, and any raw products have to be stored below ready to eat things. Also, there are designated areas in the refrigerator for certain items, so keep those in their designated places. And never put any hot foods in the refrigerator or leave the door open longer than needed. There are cold curtains to prevent the temperature from raising when you're walking in and out. But also make sure you're not overloading the coolers or freezers because that prevents airflow and makes the units work harder. Also, you need to have some rotation, which is basically that the food first in, first out, which is what FIFO stands for, and you put the newer items behind the older items so that the older items are used within that 7-day window. Okay. Next is the storing of non-TCS foods, such as flour, sugar, canned goods, etc. It should be in a clean, dry location away from other dust and contaminants and stored away from the walls and at least 6 inches off the floor. The containers should be ideally in their original packaging, especially for single-use items like a sleeve of cups or a pack of gloves. But the food itself should be in food containers. Don't use containers that were used for chemicals or any other thing. Food should only be stored in food containers. Also, they should be durable, leak-proof, able to be sealed and covered. And then those areas need to be cleaned, the floors, the walls, and the shelving, and should be cleaned on a regular basis. And the same principle applies as for cold foods, that first in, first out principle. Okay, the other thing is when you're preparing foods, you need to make sure that the workstations, cutting boards, utensils, etc. are all clean and sanitized, and you're only going to remove as much food from the cooler as you can prep in a short amount of time. This prevents sometimes temperature abuse. You're going to prep some raw meat, poultry, seafood, and things like that at a different time than produce, and you're going to return the prepped food to the cooler, or you're going to cook it as quickly as possible. Never leave things out. If it has been left out for more than the 4 hours for TCS food, then it needs to be thrown away. Also, If it's been handled by any staff who've been excluded from the operation, or it's been contaminated by hands or bodily fluids, for example, if you sneeze on it, that needs to be thrown away. Okay. Also, if you're thawing foods, there's 4 acceptable methods. One is in the refrigerator, one is to submerge it under running cold water. Um, Another is in the microwave, and then also as part of the cooking process. If it is thawed in the microwave, it needs to be cooked in a conventional cooking equipment immediately after thawing. Okay. Then the next thing is when you're cooling foods, it needs to be placed in an ice water bath in a clean prep sink or large pot filled with water. It needs to be stirred frequently. Could also be placed in a blast chiller that blasts the cold air across the food, or stirred with an ice paddle. Or you can add ice or cold water as an ingredient, but these are some ways to keep the food safe. Also, I failed to mention it earlier, but the TCS foods must be cooked to a specified minimum internal temperature, and there is a chart that can help you on the ServSafe website and other similar websites, but also will be posted in the kitchen. For serving food, you need to always use a thermometer to check the food's internal temperature. It can't be the temperature gauge on the holding unit. It has to be actually the internal temperature of the food itself. It has to be held at the correct temperature. So hot food needs to be above 135 and cold food below 41. And those temperatures need to be monitored regularly. The bare minimum is 4 hours. And if it is outside of those zones, either between 41 and 135, it needs to be thrown away. If you want to prevent spoilage, however, it can be checked every 2 hours, for example, so that there's time for corrective action if it has gone outside of that safe zone. So for example, any hot food that's dropped below 135 can be reheated and placed back in the hot holding unit. Also, we want to be able to prevent cross-contamination and time temperature abuse. One of the best ways to do that is to cover food, install to have it under a sneeze guard, and that will protect it from contaminants, and also just to maintain it at the proper temperatures, as we talked about earlier, and also follow the policies for how long food will be held and when it will be thrown out. Cold food and hot food can be held with time as the only control method. If this is the case, it has to have a label specifying the time it was removed and the time it will be, or it was removed from temperature control and the time it'll be thrown out. So for example, for cold food, it can be sold, served, or thrown out within 6 hours, but that's given that it does not exceed 70 degrees during service. Hot food is similar. It has to be held at 135 or higher, and has a label, but the difference is that it has to be sold, served, or thrown out within 4 hours rather than 6. Also, we need to minimize bare hand contact. Anything that's going to be served directly to customers without any further cooking or processing needs to not be touched as if you can. So ways to do that are to use tongs, for example, hold dishes by the bottom edge, not touch the food contact surfaces of dishes, hold flatware by the handle, avoid bare hand contact with food that's ready to eat. Also by using ice scoops or tongs to get ice, and tongs are utensils to serve the food. Okay, so the next thing we're going to discuss is allergic reactions and food allergens. So allergic reactions occur when the immune system mistakenly considers the allergen to be harmful and attacks the food protein. Food allergens are just naturally occurring proteins, but some people are sensitive to them. And when there's enough of that allergen, a reaction can occur. Depending on the person, an allergic reaction can happen just after the food's eaten or several hours later. It could include some or all of these symptoms. So, um, for example, there could be nausea, wheezing, shortness of breath, hives, itchy rashes, swelling, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, or just an itchy throat. There are several allergens, over 160, but 90% of them come from these 8 items. So milk, soy, eggs, wheat, fish, crustaceans, peanuts, and tree nuts. So in order to prevent these allergic reactions, which can be life-threatening, everyone has to take steps to prevent it. Specifically, service staff should be able to describe the menu items and preparation to the guests and identify any allergens in them and suggest some alternatives that don't have that allergen if someone notifies you that they are allergic. Also, clearly identify that guest's order to the kitchen and service staff and deliver that food separately to prevent any cross-contamination. The kitchen staff themselves should check the recipes and ingredient labels, wash, rinse, and sanitize any cookware, utensils, or equipment. Wash your hands and change gloves before preparing their food, and make sure the allergen doesn't touch anything for the customer that has that food allergy. Separate fryers and cooking oils also have to be used for that food. Label the food that's packaged on site for retail use as well, because it may also contain allergens. Okay, the next thing we're going to discuss is a type of food safety management system, which is abbreviated HACCP. HACCP. This is the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points, which are identified here. We'll go through each one. The first one is hazard analysis. It's basically a plan that's laid out to identify any safety hazards and also measures that can be taken to control them. So for example, at the cooking step of the process, one of the hazards would be the survival of pathogens if there is inadequate cooking time or temperature. So then you have to identify the critical control point. So in the example we just gave, that would be to make sure that it's cooked to the proper temperature for the amount of time that's needed to kill that pathogen. The next one is establishing critical limits, which is the limit which that hazard is acceptable without compromising food safety. And then establishing monitoring procedures. Highly detailed monitoring activities are important. So for example, there could be a checklist of how frequently temperatures are monitored to make sure that the food is safe in the operation. And then some corrective actions need to be established, which make sure that things are back on track if there's any deviation from the critical limits. Ideally correcting the problems before the end stage so that the product can be returned to a safe state, for example, by reheating or cooling before it reaches that critical point. And then also establishing some verification procedures, which basically is using methods, procedures, tests, sampling, or other evaluations to see if that control measure is working. And then also monitoring the corrective actions which are taken. And then record keeping is also important to demonstrate the effective application of the critical control points and make sure that things continue to run smoothly. Okay, so the other thing is safe facilities and equipment. There's a lot in this topic. There are local regulatory reviews that happen with construction uh, plans and requirements. They're designed so that there's a safe flow of food. And also, these reviews are to make sure that the contractors are constructing the facility correctly, using only approved equipment and design. It also can save you time and money because these reviews are conducted, things that wouldn't have to be redone, for example, or removed and replaced. But proper kitchen design is going to make sure that there's a workflow that minimizes the time food spends in the temperature danger zone and the number of times that it's handled. Also, will have a good layout that reduces the risk of cross contamination, and also equipment being placed in such a way that to prevent splashing or spillage, and also so staff can easily clean it. The flooring, for example, has to be smooth, durable, non-absorbent, easy to clean, wear, and slip resistant, and also often needs to have coving, which is a curved sealed edge that's placed between the floor and the wall to eliminate the sharp corner and make it easier to clean. Similar to the flooring, the interior doors, walls, and ceilings have to have smooth, durable, non-absorbent, and easy to clean surfaces. And there need to be hand washing stations in areas that are easy for staff to access. They should only be used for hand washing and no other purpose, and they have to have adequate barriers or distance from food and food contact surfaces. They have to be working correctly, available, well stocked and maintained. They also need to have hot and cold running water, soap, a way to dry hands, signage, and a garbage container. As far as equipment purchasing and installation, you need to look for the NSF mark whenever purchasing items to make sure that they are non-absorbent, smooth, corrosion resistant, easy to clean, durable, and resistant to damage. And then also, whenever equipment is installed, the manufacturer's instructions need to be followed and also followed during operating and maintaining that equipment. For example, for dishwashers, coolers, and freezers. One of the last items is water and sewage, which is basically the plumbing. There has to be no cross connection, which is where there's a physical link between the safe and the dirty water. Any cross connections risk contamination through backflow, and the solution to those is either an air gap or installing a vacuum breaker. Grease traps are often also required for the plumbing because the buildup of grease can reduce, sorry, the buildup of grease can block pipes, and the grease traps can help prevent that. If there is a wastewater overflow, though, the area needs to be closed, the problem corrected, and the area thoroughly cleaned before any operations can resume. And different areas of the facility also have different lighting requirements. The prep areas need to be brighter than the other areas. And the lights should also have some shatter resistant light bulbs to prevent that physical contamination, or some kind of covers. And burned out bulbs have to be replaced with the correct size ones. Ventilation systems are also required in cooking, frying, and grilling areas to improve the air quality and reduce grease and condensation buildup. And they must be cleaned and maintained and not drip onto food or equipment. Garbage also is important to consider. It has to be removed from prep areas as quickly as possible. Garbage containers need to be cleaned inside and out frequently, but this has to be done away from food prep and storage areas. Indoor garbage containers have to be leak-proof, waterproof, pest-proof, easy to clean, and covered when not in use. And they should be stored away from any food or food contact surfaces. Outdoor garbage containers have to be placed on a smooth, durable, non-absorbent surface, such as asphalt or concrete, have a tight-fitting lid, be covered, and have the drain plugs in place. Next, we're going to talk about cleaning and sanitizing. So cleaning with soap and other detergents is just one step. It's also necessary to sanitize, so they're basically two different things. Um, just because something looks clean doesn't mean that it's sanitary. You have to always ensure that the work area is cleaned and sanitized before starting to prep food. Um, Although cleaning will remove any dirt or grease, it will not kill bacteria and other pathogens. Only a sanitizer will do that. Some of the main sanitizers that are used are chlorine solutions such as bleach, quaternary solutions, which are quats, and iodine. Um, you can use these materials, but there also has to be a material safety data sheet. So if you have um, some of these are corrosive and you have to use some personal protective equipment for yourself when using those. Okay, cleaners are divided into 4 categories. One is detergents that have ingredients that penetrate and soften dirt. There's degreasers that, as the name suggests, they dissolve grease. Delimers are used on mineral deposits. Abrasive cleaners have a scouring agent that helps scrub hard to remove dirt. And then there's also using a 3-compartment sink to clean and sanitize. The steps for this would be to scrape any items into the trash that are on the plates or utensils. Then wash the items in the first sink, rinse them in the second, and sanitize them in the third, and finally air dry them on a clean and sanitized surface. Non-food contact surfaces also need to be cleaned and sanitized. Tableware and equipment should be cleaned and sanitized too, and then stored in a way that will protect it from contamination. So for example, it needs to be 6 inches off the floor. Drawers and shelves should be sanitized before plates or other items are stored on them. Glasses and cups should be stored upside down. Flatware have to have the handles up. Trays and carts also need to be cleaned and sanitized. And any food contact surfaces of stationary equipment should be covered until they're ready to be used. Also, if there's any food service chemicals need to be stored in their original containers, separate from or below food equipment, utensils, or linens. There also needs to be a cleaning program that ensures that all the surfaces are cleaned on a regular basis and the risks of transferring any bacteria or pathogens are reduced. It has 2 main components. There's a list of cleaning and sanitizing agents and supplies with instructions on their safe use and storage, and also a cleaning schedule that outlines how each item needs to be cleaned, who's responsible, and how frequently it happens. To implement that cleaning program, you need to monitor the program to make sure it's working, supervise daily cleaning routines, check all the cleaning tasks against the master cleaning schedule every day, check the master schedule for any changes in the menu, procedures, or equipment, and of course, staff is welcome to give their input. Pest management. This is a topic we don't like to discuss much because it's fairly disgusting, but these pests can enter the operation many ways. So the main way to manage pests is to deny them access. Prevent them from entering with deliveries by using approved reputable suppliers, check the deliveries before they enter the operation, and refuse any shipments that have signs of pests. The windows and vents are all screened. The self-closing devices are installed on doors, or door sweeps are installed on the doors. Any gaps or cracks are repaired. Also, weather stripping is used on any doors that don't have thresholds. Air curtains need to be above or alongside the doors. Exterior openings tightly closed. Concrete can be used to fill any holes, or sheet metal to cover openings around pipes. Screens can be over the ventilation pipes and ducts on the roof. Floor drains with hinged grates keep out rodents. Again, we need to seal any cracks in the floors or walls or where stationary equipment is fitted to the floor. The next thing we need to do is deny them food and shelter. So one place we can do that or need to do that effectively is in the garbage and recyclables. So those items need to be thrown out quickly and correctly. The containers need to be maintained in good and clean condition. The outdoor containers covered tightly, and any spills are cleaned up immediately. Also, they can be denied food and shelter through good storage, cleaning, and groundkeeping practices. So any food or supplies that come in need to be stored quickly and correctly and kept away from the walls and at least 6 inches off the floor. The products need to be rotated so pests cannot settle using that first in, first out method. Any food or beverage spills need to be cleaned up immediately. Toilets and restrooms have to be cleaned frequently. Staff need to keep the lockers and break areas clean. And cleaning tools and supplies need to be clean and dry as well. For example, the wet mops need to be hung on hooks rather than on the floor. And any water from buckets needs to be emptied to keep from attracting rodents. Also, you need to know the signs of pests. So for example, flies feed on garbage and waste and can spread pathogens, as do cockroaches. They carry pathogens such as salmonella, typhi, fungi, parasite eggs, and viruses, and they live in places that are dark, warm, moist, and hard to clean. If you see them in the daylight, you might have a major infestation, so please report that. One of the ways you can tell that there is a cockroach infestation would be a strong oily odor. Also, some droppings that look like black pepper, capsules shaped egg cases, brown, dark red, or black in color. And then also they have like a leathery, smooth, or shiny look to them. Rodents are also a very serious health hazard. They urinate and defecate as they move around. They hide during the day and stay close to their nests. They can squeeze through small holes, jump, and climb. They also have good sense of hearing, touch, and smell. And they get smart and know how to avoid bait traps and some other traps. So if you see any signs of gnaw marks, droppings that are either shiny or black if they're fresh, or gray if they're old, any urine stains, dirt tracks along the walls, nests which can be made out of cloth, hair, feathers, grass, or scraps of paper, or any holes which are often in quiet places near the food or water next to buildings, that all needs to be reported so it can be taken care of. Also, as far as storing of pesticides, it needs to have a material safety data sheet for any that are used or stored on the premises. And then also they have to be in their original containers and secure away from any food, utensils, or equipment. Most of the pest control will be done by a pest control officer, which is a licensed professional, and they know the methods that are environmentally sound and safe for operations and which techniques will work best for the different types of pests. Also, inspections are a big part of the food service industry, and failure to ensure food safety can risk the health and even the lives of our customers. It could even cause the business to shut down. So the inspector evaluates whether an operation is meeting the minimum food safety standards, and they produce a written report that notes any deficiencies. They're required for our operation and any operation that serves food, and they are determining if the minimum food safety standards are being met, and they're often based on the FDA public health intervention standards. So the best way to prepare for an inspection is to work every day as if you would be inspected and make sure everyone knows who's in charge of food safety and aware of the company policies. Another way is to conduct a self-inspection by using the same type of checklist that the regulatory authority uses and identify any risks and meet with or have a meeting to discuss those problems and correct them. During the actual inspection, you would need to ask the health inspector for identification and for the reason for the inspection. Do not refuse them entry, cooperate with them fully, take notes, and keep the relationship professional. Also be prepared to provide any records that are requested. And after the inspection, the inspector will explain the results, discuss any violations and timeframes for correction. Also, he'll make sure that you understand the violations. You're to keep copies of the report on file and act on all deficiencies within the required timeframes. And also determine the causes and take corrective action, which includes revising or creating new procedures, communicating with staff, and retraining them. And then here are the sources. And if you have any questions, you can contact me and I will get back with you.